Hello, welcome to the Rippling Pages. Happy New Year. This is a podcast on the craft of writing, crafted and curated by me, Liam Bishop. Today, I'm joined by Vincenzo Latronico, and we're here to talk about his novel that has just been translated into English by Sophie Hughes, Perfection, published by Fitzcarraldo Editions. Now, a plant-filled, clean and modern apartment in a trendy and exciting part of Berlin, fun-filled social life with income from creative opportunities. Sounds like the perfect life, doesn't it? Or is it? There's something missing from Anna and Tom's life, and they can't quite put their finger on what it is that's missing. It drives them to impatience and to the point of leaving their apartment in Berlin. Is it merely an itch they cannot scratch, or does it relate to a deep lack of authenticity that strikes at their core? With shades of Michel Houellebecq and Georges Perec, Perfection is one of Vincenzo's 4 novels, but this is his first to be translated into English. He's from Rome, but he's a translator of many books into Italian from the English. Vincenzo, thank you so much for joining me on the Rippling Pages.
Thank you for having me, Liam. It's a really big pleasure to be here.
I'm delighted to have you here, and a brilliant writer in Italian with a fantastic reputation. But obviously, to have you first in English is an absolute pleasure. So you're from Rome, but you've lived in Berlin like your characters. But where are you based now?
I'm based in Milan, which is the city also I grew up in. I have this strange misunderstanding that since I'm born in Rome, and in Italy this matters a lot, the Milan-Rome hostility has been going on for centuries. And so when people define me as a Roman writer, I understand where it comes from, but it always feels like I have been wronged somehow. No, I am currently in Milan, and it's my hometown.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll try not to stoke those fires. Yeah, Milan's a beautiful, obviously beautiful city. Shall we get into it, Vincenzo?
Yes,
Because
please.
it's the small details, isn't it, with your book? Your book opens with this description of Anna and Tom's apartment, and I just picked out some things. There's the pictures of the Taschen books, the French windows, the copies of the New Yorker and the Monocle magazine. It sounds an incredibly desirable lifestyle, and it sounds interesting, and it sounds a little bit like my home. Maybe it sounds a little bit like some of our listeners' home that are interested in literature and the arts. But who are these people, Vincenzo?
I mean, the easiest answer would be me, you, us. In the German edition of the book, I put a little quote at the end, which I didn't include in any other translation because it just felt appropriate to the German one somehow. And it's an excerpt from an essay by Hans Magnus Enzensberger, which goes something like, the fact that you, dear reader, are reading this means by itself that you belong in it. This interest in these details, I think, started during the pandemic when we were all locked up at home. I opened an Instagram account, which I had never had because I was lonely and bored and desperate, like most people. And so I started seeing other people's apartments, strangers' apartments, which I never had because I had kept off Instagram until 2020. I don't know how I was able to. And I realized they looked exactly like mine. Like they had monstera plants, they had reclaimed wooden shelves, they had cheap mid-century vintage furniture picked up at flea markets. And these people were, I was in Berlin at the time, and these people were in southern Italy, they were in Sweden, they were in the US, and their living room looked just like mine. And this is, I think, the kind of feeling that I wanted to convey.
I mean, I don't have any mid-century. Mine's more IKEA than mid-century. But what you're describing in this opening then is not their apartment. It's a picture of their apartment. But as you said, it gives us an idea of the world that you're trying to describe. And so, what is it then that sort of sets you off on this journey that they take? It's not a huge, it's not a long novel. It's not an epic by any means, but they do go on a journey of sorts. And what is it that sort of sets them off on this journey?
I mean, I think that what set me off on the journey of writing this book was really opening my eyes on the deep, pervasive, wide-reaching impact that social media have on the way we understand our life, the way we conceptualize it, from the furniture we have to the musical tastes we have, to even our politics, our view of ourselves, our ideas of relationships. What really struck me at the beginning was how immediately reachable everything seems. Even those hyper-curated images of lives, such as the ones that I described in the book, are very, very easy to reconstruct with a little money, or even not a little money, but just time to sift and look. But this sort of becomes a never-ending quest, right? The novel itself is basically a rewriting of a 1960s book by Georges Perec called Things, in which Perec was trying to describe consumerism, and he did it by describing the life of a couple, their inner life, their hopes, their fears, their expectations, only by describing their relationship to objects. So which objects they coveted, which objects they had and hated, which drew their attention in storefronts. And he was able to tell their story and to tell the story of the revolution, their coming of age, just through the evolution of their tastes and interests and consumerist obsessions. And I realized that something very similar could be done for our generation, or at least for mine, so-called millennials. It's not a word I like very much, but let's use it anyway. And so I tried to do it. Originally, at the beginning, it was just not even an experiment. It was just a game. I was depressed and bored in the infinite days of the pandemic. And I said, okay, let's try to rewrite this book paragraph by paragraph, only replacing 2020 Berlin where there was 1962 Paris. And then the game kind of took hold, and it started, and it worked way more than I expected.
You're treading quite a fine line, and a fine line that Perec tread as well. And it's this sort of balance between, well, perhaps you can tell me, how did it, how did you write this novel about these two characters that we ultimately learn to care about? Or do you want us to care about?
It's a very good question. I mean, so in principle, this is the story of two young people who moved to Berlin at the time in which Berlin was still an incredibly cheap place to move to and work from if you worked in something that could happen just from your computer. And they were part of this broader movement that happened in Europe in around 2010 somehow. And they do build what looks to them and to everyone from the outside a perfect life there. And yet they are dissatisfied, they're unhappy, and they don't understand why. This bafflement at their own dissatisfaction ultimately drives them further and further away from this life that they built, because they don't understand what's wrong. They did everything right. Isn't it? Like, their pictures are perfect. It's very easy, yes, to depict this kind of attitude as shallow, as superficial, as hetero-directed, as young people brainwashed by social media. And to some extent, it's what Perec does in his book. Shows us that they are fools who have been brainwashed by television and magazine commercials, and they will never be able to reach happiness because of the extent to which they have subscribed to the consumerist worldview. And Perec can do it because he situates himself outside of it. He doesn't share their life, their mistakes, but I do. I mean, the book is written entirely in the second person plural. There is almost nothing that one character does and that the other doesn't. I deliberately included no information to distinguish one from the other, not even physical information about them, because I wanted the subject of the book to be collective. And in this collective, which is represented by a couple in the book, but I feel that I completely belong, as do many of the people in my wider social sphere. And I think that this is why, ultimately, even though they clearly make wrong choices, shallow choices, they clearly do not act in the best interest of their happiness, you do not judge them for this, because at least I can speak for myself, but it's what I do too. I don't have an answer. My book does pose a question. Why are these people unhappy? Their apartment is perfect. Their sex life is good. They have a nice circle of friends. They have a job that they chose. They're healthy. What's your problem? And I don't have the answer. I mean, it's what I ask myself as well.
It's so interesting for that, because you're following the arc. I guess the arc of these characters is, there's not a kind of, it's not a traditional kind of narrative arc. There's not a conflict. So there's not a resolution. There's not a kind of rise in action. And we kind of follow them as this, the satisfaction continues, and then they keep making these choices. If I was going to describe Perec's book, I'd describe it in similar ways that I describe yours to some extent. And there are listeners out there, you've just got to read these two books. Is this then a type of novel? And I guess, is it a type of novel that could only be written in a city or about a city or from a city? Could you have written this novel, I guess, if you were not in Berlin?
I think that what Perec did, he found a form to tell the story of people who grow up in a world that is radically different from the world they were born into, in like a mental horizon, let's say. In his case, it was the consumerist revolution that happened, at the late 50s, early 60s. And so he found himself and his generation as young adults, like mid-20s, in a world that was completely different from that for which they grew up. And I think that us who came of age on the cusp of the digital divide had a somewhat similar experience in that, at least I am 40, I have lived the first half of my life in an internet-free world. And I have very clear memories of depending on paper maps, on landlines, and so on. And all this seems like prehistory now. And this change has been so radical and so far-reaching, almost no minor aspect of our life is unchanged. And we tend to underestimate how confused and lost this makes people feel. And I think that Perec's form, which is a form that is basically just made of descriptions, there is a plot in his book as in mine, and it's a plot, that has events. The people move here and there, they try to change their life and fail, and then try again and kind of manage. But this plot is kind of dissolved in descriptions of their apartment, their friend circle, their job, their sex life. And I think that this method only works if the main characters of the story belong to a generation that is kind of over eager to adapt to a new world, because ultimately they don't deeply know how to move in it.
Was it then, and is there, so where did this, writing this novel then, how was that felt within you, I guess?
For me, the clearest sign of this is the recent and pervasive obsession with the authenticity and nature. And if you think about it, over the past few years, almost every aspect of our life has been somehow influenced by some longing for a lost authenticity. From the craft beer mania, this was the very first sign, single origin coffee, natural wine, homemade sourdough bread. All of these things our grandmothers would have found conservative. Why do we look to that for comfort? And I think the answer is because we feel that something is lost. We cannot put our finger on it because, of course, every aspect, every narrowly defined aspect of our life has become more efficient, better through the use of digital technology. But something deep down in us doesn't recognize this as the world we grew up in. And this is what the authenticity business complex is trying to sell us. And of course, this hole can never be filled because not because the products that we're sold are not authentic, whatever that means, but because the longing comes from somewhere deeper. And I think that this is the source of the misery and dissatisfaction of the characters I write about.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. It's that continual need, that continual fill, and it's the sense. And the word you said was comfort, and that's what I was trying to wonder. Where is this kind of coming from? And maybe that's within us all the time, and it's going through different generations. But this idea of being lost, beyond identifying with Anna and Tom, because I recognize some things in their life, things they have that I have in mine. I think I recognize, because I felt that sense of loss, that sense of where do we get comfort from the world around us as we get older and with the world changes. And we're going to have a quick break on the Ripping Pages, but do come back. We'll be talking more to Vincenzo about perfection, and we might even do a little bit more relationship advice. Come back soon. Thanks so much for joining me on the Rippling Pages. Now, if you're enjoying today's show, if you enjoyed any of the other shows, why not leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcast provider? Doing so increases the reach of the podcast, increases the reach of these fantastic books like Vincenzo, fantastic writers too. Thanks so much. Otherwise, I will see you soon. So, welcome back to the Rippling Pages. We're talking about Perfection by Vincenzo Latronico. And it's kind of like they live in this bubble within Berlin. And there are parts, and the way that you use Berlin, the way you use the city, is they quite literally seem lost sometimes. They don't know all of Berlin. The German people, German residents, are not always part of their friend and social group, and they find that they go back to make friends with other international residents of. But I wondered then, because one of the things they do is they have quite a vibrant social life. They visit some sort of BDSM clubs and that kind of thing, and they have there's this kind of erotic world as well that they explore. But you make the point explicitly sometimes about them being in love. Do you think they're in love?
I think that love is a rather dangerous topic. It's like one of those dyes that you see if you just put a drop in a glass of clear water, it all seeps and becomes of that color. In that, if you put even just a drop of love in a novel, then it becomes a love story. And then you have to tell how they met, how the relationship progressed. You have to tell about their fights and about their different aspirations. And I didn't want to do that, not because I don't find it interesting, but because I was interested in this book in something else, which is I wanted a book in which the story is told not by the actions of the main characters, but by the backgrounds. This is a book that's just about backgrounds, just about the what happens in the details. And so I just wanted this couple to be given for granted, and for love not to be an issue that has to be explored. This is also because I wanted the novel to be a collective novel. I wanted it to be about two people, because if it's about two, it can be about several. If I started to talk about love, I would have needed to say what his and her aspirations were, how they differed, how their expectations matched and didn't match. And this would have made it a novel about individuals. I didn't want that for this book. What's funny is that I've had two radically different readings given to me by readers and friends. I mean, readers now that the book has been out for a few years, in Italian at least. But even while I was writing it, I would share some chapters with my friends and say, what do you think? And especially the sex chapter that you just referred to. I sent it to my ex-boyfriend and he said, this is the nightmare of heterosexuality. And then I sent it to a friend who's a woman and a writer, and she said, oh my God, if only I could have what they have. And wow, I see both of their points. I don't know who is right. It's I myself don't have an answer. It's interesting. I just didn't want it to be a question for me. But I mean, what do you think?
Well, I thought they had what they had is they had some form of. I think they had various forms of connection. I think on some level they were intellectually connected. They sort of share interests. Well, we're making assumptions out from the things that you're sort of surrounded by to some extent. But it seemed like they have a shared interest in work. Whether that's shallow or not, I'm not sure. But they had shared interest in work. They were interested in exploring the erotic world of Berlin, and they kind of did that together. And it seemed quite a safe relationship, I would say. But
yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because I think that one could say that they are people and this is an idea I'm just exploring right now. I don't think I ever explicitly saw it this way, but I think that they are people for whom love is not necessarily the first and only way to self-realization and to fulfillment. It is a condition of fulfillment, but not its aim. And maybe this is also something that has to do with the fact that I'm deeply jealous of the people who have these infinitely long relationships, like people who meet at 20 and they're still together at 40. And of course, to a certain extent, some of these relationships can be understood as boring. But what isn't? Like, any job, the job of your dreams that you do for 20 years becomes boring. The apartment that you long for and ultimately buy after saving for a lifetime, after 20 years becomes boring. So maybe that's not a problem, right? It's not something that should go against it. And I have a few friends who are in relationships like this, and I'm very jealous of them. I'm very fascinated by the depth that these relationships can reach, but also the kind of unquestioningness that there is about it. Yes, of course we are together. Yes, of course I breathe oxygen. There is something about this that I find very fascinating, and maybe this fascination is one of the reasons I wrote them like this.
Yeah, that's sort of, it's really fascinating because I kind of, I see some of that, and it does feel to some extent like they dip their toes, and that's not a euphemism. They dip their toes into this kind of, whatever you want to call it, but they go to the the BDSM club, they go to these parties, and they kind of try it a little bit, and then they sort of go, actually, maybe this isn't for me. And it just felt like there was this other world. Maybe there was this sort of tantalizing sense of, oh, maybe. And I guess just thinking about then what we've discussed, does that side of Berlin, does it represent a new path for them, or is it just another one of these desires that sort of gets worn out?
I think that in their case, it's just about FOMO, right? It's just about the normative aspect of learning how life is presented through a medium. People who are maybe content with their sex life, that can be in whatever form they please, start asking themselves, well, shouldn't I be trying polyamory? Why am I not doing it? Am I not adventurous enough? Am I conservative? Am I uncool? Am I trapped in a patriarchal mindset? And then all of a sudden the blame shifts on yourself, whereas perhaps you were just extremely content with whatever you had before. And this kind of normative aspect about how life should be is an essential trait of both advertising and of perceiving other people's lives through social media. And of course, there's an aspect of curiosity and discovery, which is very important, which is that you discover new possibilities these ways, and you discover that life can be different from what you have. But also this subtly erodes your confidence that the way you have built your life, the way you understand yourself, is good enough. And this slow injecting of insecurity is the crucial mechanism of advertisement, because they make you insecure and then they sell you something to become more secure. And this is the same thing that happens, I feel, with a lot of social media. And I think that this kind of discontent that doesn't have a clear object is the feeling that permeates the whole novel.
Yeah, wow, discontent without a clear object. What a fantastic way to say it. The one thing I wanted to ask you about, you write about the migrant crisis, and this has quite a significant effect on Anna and Tom's life and their work. I don't know if you could just talk a little bit about why you chose to include this and how you include it.
I mean, the book, the way we've talked about it now, which is a true way of describing this book, makes it look like it's set in an incredibly narrow and tight bubble of privilege, because it is. And it's also one of the effects that the self-reinforcing mechanism of social media can have, is that you lose sight of anything that doesn't belong to the bubble that you currently are into. And this is, I think, something that is even more the case in a milieu such as the one I was writing about, which is expats in Berlin, because you have very few occasions of intersecting with the real life of the city or the country that you're in. I know a lot of people who have lived in Berlin for years, for decades, even without speaking German. This was possible there, this kind of insularity. And but the world out there exists. As much as we can try to insulate ourselves from it by a carefully curated social media feed. And I think that for many people in the bubble that I didn't really belong in, but for many people I knew, they woke up to politics one day when Angela Merkel, with a move that I found unprecedented European politics this century, opened Germany's door to 1 million refugees. And all of a sudden, there was a frenzy of activity among people who hadn't cared at all about actual activism, day-to-day, on the streets activism. All of a sudden, everyone was very engaged into doing something for this trendy cause. And of course, the engagement that my characters show is self-serving, is shallow, and it's ultimately pathetic and ineffective. But I somehow liked to remind them and the readers as well that everyone is very much aware that this is a bubble that tries to insulate itself from the outside world. But of course, that's impossible. And I mean, I wrote this book I started in 2020, I finished it in 2021. Events in Europe since then have only shown even more how not insulated we are from these kinds of, from the movements of history. I felt almost self-conscious when the book came out. In German, it was at the very beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. And all of a sudden, it felt extremely self-absorbed to be writing about the interior design of millennial apartments. But I mean, I tell myself, and I think that the episode of the migrant crisis in the book is a sign of this. I am writing about this bubble to underline how narrow it is. And I think that that's the moment in which the cards fall on the table.
The phrase you use, it creates a reality that they cannot unsee. So it creates a lot of work for them, doesn't it? And which means they make money from it to some extent. But it affects them, doesn't it? It affects them in some way. It doesn't, it rocks the world, it rocks the bubble to some extent.
Yeah, but then ultimately this is I mean, it could rock their world the way that any kind of traumatic event from the minimal to the societal can change someone's perspective on life and on themselves. Or you can just react to it in the moment and then fall back on denial, which is what they do, and which is what I guess many of the people that I've seen being involved with these flashes of social media induced activism ultimately revert to when the cause stops. Because I mean, I've been doing activism since I was a kid. It was in Milan. I was part of a squat in the early 2000s. I am now active in some areas related to STDs and HIV, especially in Milan. And, activism is an extremely boring and rote and repetitive and unglamorous work. It involves doing the same thing over and over in small, dimly lit rooms with sparse and grumpy people that sometimes you can do something for. But it's also good.
Credit to you. Are you still doing activism now, you said?
Yes, I mean, I'm involved with a collective in Milan that offers anonymous, free, instant testing for STDs mostly to the sex worker and to the queer community. So we go on streets or in front of clubs or in front of bars and just set up these stands to offer counseling on STDs and to offer testing. And to people that would normally not really be reached for several different kinds of reasons by the official healthcare system, maybe because they're undocumented, maybe because they are mistrustful, maybe because they just wouldn't think about it.
But thanks for sharing that. You're a well-established name in Italian literature, global literature. How does it feel to be, to have your first book published in English? Not that should necessarily feel any more special than any other publication, but maybe we can just reflect on some of these, what it's like to be translated into another language.
It does feel special in a way, and it's undeniably so. I mean, yes, this is my fourth novel in Italian, my first in English, but since my very first book, I, like most of my peers that I know, Italian writers, have always seen being translated into English as a milestone of sorts, as the beginning of a different phase of one's path as a writer. I'm extremely excited. I'm extremely proud also. And and it's strange because as a translator myself and as someone who does speak a little English, I was very curious and also scared of reading the translation when I was sent it by the translator Sophie Hughes. And she did such an incredible job. There were times in which I was like, wow, this, I mean, I shouldn't say this myself, so pardon the grandiosity of it, but I read a sentence and I was like, wow, I can't have written this. This must have been kind of interpolated. And then I just went into Italian and said like, oh no, it just sounds just so much better. She really nailed it. And this happened over and over again. She did an outstanding job, really.
Interesting. Well, it's credit to yourself, credit to Sophie. I mean, anyone listening to this will heard that you've got impeccable English, so which I bet was interesting in itself. Actually, you know, reading a translator when obviously your English is pretty good. I bet that was quite an interesting challenge.
Yeah, but you know, it's strange because I have worked for, in some ways, I am always fascinated by those writers, you know, the famous example of Nabokov or of Joseph Conrad, who could write in a language not their own, because I have the feeling that even if my English were 99% of the maximum, well, literature happens in that remaining 1%. It happens, you know, just up there. And if my English were 99.5%, well, literature actually happens in that 0.5% that I still haven't reached. So somehow I don't think that I would ever feel confident writing a novel or like a literary memoir straight into English.
Well, it is to your English. It's not to my Italian. It's to your English that we've been able to have this conversation. And it is to with the help of Sophie Hughes that we can read your work as well. And you can do that on the 13th of February when it is released in the UK. That's perfection. But otherwise, for now, Vincenzo, it has been my absolute pleasure to have you on the Ripping Pages. Thanks so much for giving up your time. I can't wait for it to be released.
It was my pleasure, Liam. Thank you.